Last week's video was a documentation of my last 30-day photography challenge, in which I shot one photography assignment every day. Over the course of the 30 days, I was able to capture a few good photos and a few lesser good photos. In this video, I'm going to show you how I edited my 5 favorite photos of the 30-day challenge. The 5 photos I decided that are my favorites of the challenge are these. This photo of the tree rising above the forest in the mist just looks so good. I definitely count this to one of my favorites of the 30 days. I already explained how much I like this photo in the last video, so of course it is in this list. The self-portrait of me here is also a photo I like a lot. As mentioned in the last video, when I slightly teased you, I really look forward to showing you the rest of this photography project. This photo is technically not part of the challenge, but I showed it to you in the last video because I liked it so much, so I thought why not show you the edit. And the last photo on this list is the close-up of an old broken watch of mine. What gets me here is the subtle color contrast created by the orange tint coming from the side. With that said, let's switch over to Lightroom and start editing these. I began with the photo of the tree. The way I usually proceed is by regaining details in both the highlights and the shadows in the basic adjustments. This photo is not an exception. To enhance the softness created by the clouds, I pulled down the clarity to -30. Additionally, I corrected the white balance, tint, and overall exposure. For this image, I wanted the white balance to lean slightly towards the cold side to represent the actual conditions of the day. Also, I quite like a very little bit of green tint in photos which have a lot of green, so that's what I also did here. Lastly, I pushed up the exposure a bit. Next, I continued with the curves. With the curves, I just did what I usually do. I create some contrast with the good old S-curve, but also soften that again by pulling up the blacks and pulling down the whites a little. Then I switched over to the red curve, with which I added some more green tint to the photo. Continuing further down Lightroom, I edited the colors in the HSL tab. I didn't really do much here, basically I just desaturated all the colors. The 2 dominant colors, in this case green and yellow, I desaturated less than the others. I also pulled the hue of the yellows over towards green because I like my greens to be very green. Next, I gave the whole photo a colder look by adding some blues in the entire image in split toning. My standard blue hue, currently at least, is 210, so I choose that and added just a wee touch of it both in the shadows and highlights. Next, I added my beloved graduated filters. I've talked about these a lot on the channel, they are one of my favorite tools in Lightroom. What I did was just add a filter from every edge of the photo and darken it, and also pull down the clarity even further. Sometimes I additionally pulled down the dehaze slider as well. Then, to finish off the photo, I added some grain to the image and did some last tiny little corrections. This here is the color version of the end result. This version is the one I showed you in the behind the scenes video, however the version for the assignment required a few extra steps because the assignment of that day was to shoot a black and white photo. So what I did in Lightroom was convert the photo to black and white, but because I had added some color in the red curves, the photo was still tinted. So for the black and white version, I took that tint out again, which results in this photo. This is the version from the 30-day challenge. Next up, let me show you the edit of this portrait of Melly. This is how the raw photo looks. So again, I brought back some dynamic range by pulling down the highlights and whites. What I did differently here is, to add some more contrast, I actually pushed down the shadows. For this photo, I immediately felt that a black and white was appropriate, so I converted it straight away. To soften the whole photo a little, I pulled down the clarity to -50, and for more contrast, I added some dehazing. Next, I continued to the curves, where I added even more contrast with the classic S-curve again, but this time significantly pulling down the whites to avoid blown out parts in Melly's hat. Here also, I pulled up the blacks a little. At this point, I noticed the contrast had become a little too strong, therefore I went back to the basic adjustments and pulled down the contrast slider, and I pushed the shadows up a bit. After getting the amount of contrast I was satisfied with, I added some sharpening, and then it was time for my good old graduated filters. I used those on this image to darken the top, bottom, and right side of the photo. I didn't darken the left side because that's where the sunlight comes from, and I think it would look a little bit strange if I darkened that side. After adding those, I decided to have the clarity not as low as it was. I pushed it up a bit to -35. Then I added a little bit of grain and checked the before and after of the edit to get a feel of what changes I still need to make. I decided to darken the photo a little more, and then it was finished to me, so here is the final result. The next edit is the one I did on the self-portrait of me wearing a mask made of toilet paper. Same as before, I regained many details by pulling up the shadows and pulling down the highlights. The white balance was much too yellow for me, so I pulled that towards the blue side and I set the tint to 0. As I often like to do, I also softened this photo by pulling down the clarity. And to add a wee bit of contrast, I added some dehaze. In the curves, I added some more contrast with a simple S-curve again, and then noticed that the image is too dark, so I went back up to the basic adjustments and increased the exposure. Then back down in the curves, I again added a green tint to the photo by pulling down the red curve a little bit. Then I continued to the split toning tab. I was really going for a slightly warm and greenish look for this photo, so I added a bit of the hue 55, which is more or less yellow. I always try to be careful when adding split toning to not go overboard, so for this photo I set the saturation of the hue to 5 in both the highlights and the shadows. Then it was time to edit the colors. First I went down to the calibration tab and set the blue slider to -15, which, if done extremely, gives an orange and teal look. But in this case I only wanted that effect in a very subtle way. The rest of my color editing was then done in the HSL tab, where I did all sorts of little adjustments. What I think was important here is that I pushed the hue of the red a little towards orange, which influenced my skin tones. I found that they were leaning too far towards red. I also thought my skin tones were slightly oversaturated, therefore I desaturated the oranges a little and increased the luminance. The other things I did were just minor changes. I think the skin tones were the most important here. Next I added some grain and sharpening to the photo. Then while analyzing the intensity of the grain, I found that my skin tones were still not quite perfect, so I went back to the HSL tab again and pushed the orange hue over +5 to yellow, and the red a little more to the orange. After getting that right, I decided it was time for some more graduated filters. For this photo I didn't do that much though, I just added one filter from the right and one filter from the bottom, which just darkened the sides a little. And with those adjustments done, the photo was completed. Here's the before and after. Next I edited the photo of the streetlight. For this photo I decided to crop the top and the bottom to get this quadratic aspect ratio. After the crop, the first thing I did, even before the basic adjustments, was to pull over the blue slider in the calibration tab to increase the orange and teal look of this photo. Then I continued to the basic adjustments, where I did pretty much the same as always. Important here was to pull down the white balance a little to increase the blue tones in the sky. After that, I moved on to the curves, where I added some greens into the shadows with the red channel to give the blue more of a teal look. And in the RGB channel, I simply made my standard S-curve for the contrast. Then next, I added some grain. By the way, I'm always pretty insecure about the amount of grain to add. At the moment, I usually go for an amount of somewhere between 30 and 40. The size is mostly 35, and the roughness I just leave at the default setting. Then I added a graduated filter. I kept it pretty simple here and just darkened the right side of the image. Next I continued to the HSL tab, where I edited the colors. Again, many little changes, mostly desaturating the colors a little. The most important adjustment in the HSL tab was the blue, which I desaturated strongly to make the color contrast a little more subtle. I don't like when the orange and teal look is brutally slapped onto a photo or a video and just looks completely overboard. I like to keep it subtle, maybe very subtle. For this photo, I pulled the saturation of the blue down to -50. After that, I decided not to keep it at one graduated filter. I added some darkening from the bottom and another one diagonally from the top left because I found that that corner was a little too bright. With that done, the edit was completed. Here is the before and after. Lastly, I edited the photo of the watch. Same as the previous photo, I cropped this image to a quadratic aspect ratio. Then, as usual, I went over the settings in the Basic Adjustments tab. Overall, I brightened the image, dehazed it, and shifted the white balance a little towards the cold. Then, I was going for some orange and teal again, so I scrolled down to the Calibration tab and set the blue hue slider to -30. Then in the curves, I added a good portion of contrast, and in the red channel, I added some greens to the shadows to get those teal tones going. Then, I added even more blue to the shadows in split toning and checked the current before and after. As you can see, the image now has an overall blue tone. I went to the basic adjustments again, just to set the tint a tiny bit greener and add some extra contrast. Then I went to the HSL tab and basically just desaturated everything, but I kept the blue and orange quite normal. Next, I added some sharpening in the detail tab, and then the photo was ready for some graduated filters. I used one filter each for every corner. The top right and bottom left corner, so the strap of the watch, were both darkened, and I added a touch of blue in those areas. I wanted to create a sort of diagonal light direction going from the top left, therefore the filter from the top left added some brightness from that corner. And lastly, the filter from the bottom right also brightened that corner, but more importantly, I added a lot, and I mean a lot, of warmth to that filter to create this orange tint coming from the side, which I think looks like a colored light from that direction. And that was the edit for this photo. Here is the before and after. Those were the edits on my 5 favorite photos from the 30-day challenge. I hope watching my editing process was in some way helpful or just in other ways valuable to you. If so, leave a like, and I'll hopefully see you again next week in the next video. Until then, goodbye.